Well, by now you should know the drill if you've been following along. We've moved along to Lesson 5. So inside the Lesson 1.5 folder, you'll see a project file called 5-compositions. That's the one we want. So I'm going to open that up just so I can pound some of the concepts we're going to cover here into your brain as bluntly as possible. I'm going to start out by creating a project the silliest, least efficient way possible. And I'm going to do that by adding some of the pieces here in car pieces, the Brian driving loop. We'll drag that into our compositions composition. The car.psd is already in there. We don't need that, but I'm going to open up my wheel.psd folder here, which gives me two wheel layers. I'm going to grab both of those. We're going to drag both of those into our compositions composition as well. And that gives us a kind of a hodgepodge of things to work on here. Drag my wheels out of the way. In fact, I'll drag them over on top of where one wheel needs to be. We'll be duplicating this a little bit later to make the front wheel. Let's address the issue of this handsome fellow first. I'm going to drag him kind of up into place. A little bit too big for our model car, right? So we're going to shrink him down. We need him to be about big enough so that his back rests against the seat, but his hand is properly on the steering wheel. So a little smaller yet still than what we have here. That's going to be pretty good. Now, obviously, we've got a layer sorting problem here in that our handsome fellow is, in fact, basically missing his legs and hanging out over the side of the car here, which is really gruesome to even think about. So we're going to move him to the back of the composition with our keyboard shortcut, Command-Shift-Left bracket on the Mac, Control-Shift-Left bracket on Windows. That pops me completely behind the car, so now I'm not so gruesomely cut in two. Let me nudge myself back into the comfy seat just a bit more to get my hand where I want it. Now we have another sorting problem, and that is I'm behind the car just the way I need to be. However, my hand isn't. My hand needs to be up on the wheel instead of embedded through it right now. Well, a little trick that's going to introduce a topic we'll be talking more about later is I'm going to duplicate this layer, Command-D. Now we have two copies of the layer. I'm going to use the Command key on Mac, Control key on Windows, plus the right bracket key to change the sort order in the timeline. So I'm actually moving this layer forward one layer, which puts it in front of the car. But that kind of brings us back to where we were before, doesn't it? Well, that's easy to fix if we're willing to use the mask tools. Let me grab our tool palette, bring it over. Just grab the pen tool that you see right here. We're going to click just 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 5. To close it, that's going to mask off everything but my hand. My hand won't move during the course of this animation. And if I tap the space bar, you'll see I'm happily sitting in the car. Let me get our selection tool and click off to deselect everything. Space bar again. You'll see there I am, happily waving to all of you. Isn't that great? Okay, that's step 1. Well, really, that's about 4 steps. So that's step 1 through 4. So now that we've achieved this wonderfully realistic effect, I'm going to concentrate on our wheel. I just want to see the wheel and work with the wheel for a few minutes, so let me center it here in our comp window. And now let me go down and solo our wheel layers. Just a quick little solo on both of those two will allow us to only see our wheel. Now, what's the deal with these 2 layers here? Why do I have 2 layers making up the wheel? Well, this is one of my little recommended tricks to you for faking 3D shading stuff in After Effects. In this case, I've got a perfectly round object that I want rotating around. But this object is actually taken from a photograph of a real toy, a real Italian turn-of-the-century toy that I actually keep in my living room now. This toy has, all this interesting printing on it and stuff, and these spokes that'll obviously rotate around. But it also had, when I took the photograph, a lot of dimensional hints. It had highlights on the wheel that let me know where the lights were coming from. And it had this kind of shading where the dark parts of the wheel basically showed us that the wheel's kind of balloon-shaped, right? Typical visual cues. Trouble is, if I just want to spin this wheel now, if these highlights and shadows spun as well, the result we would get would not be very realistic at all because, in the 3D world, shading doesn't change just because the rotation of an object changes. Unless the light is rotating with the object, it would look very fakey. So what I have here on layer 1 is a layer that's nothing but highlights. Let me look at this against a black background so you can maybe see it a little more clearly. I can toggle that really quickly by holding down the Option key on Mac, Alt key on Windows, and just clicking on this gray area here to turn off and back on and off our checkerboard background. And now if I just click and drag here, it'll select the topmost layer, and you can see that the topmost layer is a highlight and shadow area that I kind of extracted, really more by hand painting than anything else, from the original photograph. What I really did was painstakingly dodged and burned the wheel itself to make it as flat as possible with as few shading cues as possible so that there wasn't any dimensional information at all. And then looking at the original photograph, comparing it with the original photograph on a separate layer, I created these highlights and such. The results of this are that I can rotate the backmost layer, and it will appear as if this 3D wheel is rotating because the highlights will stay fixed in 2D space. Seems like a lot of prep work, but I think it'll be worth it. I'm going to go down and set a rotational keyframe for our wheel layer. That's our second layer. Oops, my timeline marker isn't anywhere here near the front, so let's hit the home key first to bring the timeline marker to the first frame. There we go. Now I'll set a rotational keyframe. Of course, you could also hit Option R if you want to use the keyboard shortcut, Alt R on Windows. We won't do that for now. Now let me jump to the end of our composition, and we'll adjust the rotation value here. And let's look at the comp window again as I adjust the rotation value by dragging on the slider, and you'll see kind of what I was going for. Now, it's not 100% convincing. It's not an absolute perfect photographic illusion, but it's enough of a preserved visual cue by keeping the highlights separate on a separate layer that when added to a larger animation, this will be just enough to make things look that much more realistic. It's a kind of an esoteric tip, but it works really, really well. We're in a 10-second plus composition here. 10 seconds, 20 frames, as a matter of fact, which is a little awkward, but for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. Approximately 10 rotations over 10 seconds would give us a reasonable rotation rate, I think. So let me just select our main rotation value and type in 10. Click Enter. Zoom back out in the timeline. Oop, not that far. I still want to see what's going on here. I'll center this. And let me talk about one other quick little composition trick here, and that is the idea of a region of interest. I want to generate a RAM preview now of my rotating wheel to see what that looks like. But I don't want to cache my entire screen because it's mostly black with nothing going on. Why take up all of that space in RAM with empty black screen when all I really want to know is what's animating in this portion of the screen right here? So I can do that by using what's known as the region of interest, or sometimes referred to as the ROI among the people who use shortcuts like that. Anyway, I'm going to select that tool, drag a box around our wheel. You won't see much in the way of difference now because we're just masking off black. But in the meanwhile, After Effects is only going to RAM preview the area inside this region of interest. Let me set this to best quality. Hit our RAM preview key, which is 0. It's going to very, very quickly load that into RAM, much faster than actual speed. And now we're seeing it playing at actual speed. All right, so that works. Let's turn off solo for our wheel now that we've managed to create our animation. And now that I've turned off solo and we can see our car, you can see a better representation of our region of interest up here. It only allows us to see exactly what's inside of the box and nothing else that's outside of it. Good thing to know. Now, some of the things I'm going to be doing coming up are not going to work that well against a black background, but I don't want to be distracting by having this composited against a checkerboard background either. So I'm going to change the background color real quick. Keyboard shortcut for that is Command-Shift-B on the Mac, Control-Shift-B on Windows for background. And I'll just choose something lighter. It doesn't have to be pure white, so I'll just click on the eyedropper and pick one of the lighter colors from this floating palette right here in the front, as a matter of fact. Click OK. Now we have a background that is white. If I don't want to bother with my region of interest anymore, I'll just toggle it off. It is a toggle. Turn it off, and now, voila, we see our entire composition again, complete with a wacky waving guy in the middle. Now I'm going to select both of my wheel layers. I'm going to hit Command-D to duplicate these layers. And for those of you who've used After Effects for a while who are scratching your heads going, why is he doing it like this? Again, I just want to point out I'm purposely doing this the inefficient way just to contrast with the cool, efficient ways we've got coming up. All right? So I've duplicated this layer. Now you can see the way After Effects duplicates selected layers. It puts each copy directly above its original. I want both of these wheel layers to be in front, though. So with both of them highlighted, I'll just hit Command-Shift right bracket, and that'll bring everything to the front. And now I need to move our wheel to the other end of the car. So I'll just grab my wheels. They happen to both be selected after all. I don't have to worry about position because I'm not animating position. I can change that all I want. And I'm going to drag these wheels to the front end of the car. And a tap on the spacebar shows we now have 2 rotating wheels and a happy driver. Hi, everybody. I'm out driving my little car. Let me zoom out a tick now and talk about why most of what I just did was really silly and why this project is basically kind of stupid right now. One big reason is our timeline is way more complex than it needs to be for what we see going on here. You got a couple of copies of duplicated wheels and highlights. We've got keyframes for two elements that are moving identically, but we've got those keyframes existing twice in the same comp, which is never really a good idea, because now if I wanted to go and adjust the speed of one of our wheels, let me do that just by double-clicking on the second keyframe, which allows me to enter the value directly. I'll type in, say, 12, click OK. If I'm not careful, I've suddenly created a situation where I've got wheels spinning at different speeds. This one's doing 12 rotations and this one's doing 10. Well, that's no good, okay? So there's a lot more we could do about organizing this file that would make it more efficient. Let me undo the keyframe change that I just made. Now let's just double check the value of that last keyframe. Yeah, we're good. Another problem that we've obviously generated for ourselves here is that we've essentially built an object. The object has some moving parts, and it happens to have a jolly passenger, but this is nonetheless, visually at least, a single object. But if I was to attempt to adjust the object, say I needed it to be a little larger or a little smaller or animate it moving across the screen, the current organization of the project will make this impractical. Just clicking and dragging on, say, the body and moving it around isn't going to help me very much, because I've got a real weird situation here now where my hand is actually growing out of the car, and it's not attached to the wheels, and it's not attached to me, and basically all of these things need to be attached together. One great tool After Effects gives us for setting up little hierarchies like this, where things are attached to other things, is parenting. If we take a look at our timeline down here, and actually I'm going to need to bring up my parenting panel. I will right-click on one of the panels up here and choose from the panel's pop-up Parent, and that reveals our parenting pop-up. Now if you take a close look here, the parent values are all set to none. Parenting is actually really simple. All you need to do is tell After Effects what you want the parent of an object to be, and then that object will inherit all of the geometric information of its parent object. In this case, the car.psd is the main body to which everything else is attached. So we're going to want to parent basically everything to the car body. Really easy to do. You have a choice of either selecting in a pop-up the name of the layer that you want to parent to, which is car.psd in our case here. Let go. And you'll see the name car.psd now appears next to the highlights. That's fine. You can also select multiple layers, Shift Select, and make a choice, and then all of the selected layers will be set to the new parent. Let me scroll down in our timeline. You can use the hand tool for that as well. Very handy thing, no pun intended. And select my other two layers I need to parent and show you perhaps the most visually intuitive way to do this, and that is with the little spiral that you see to the left of the pop-up. This is what they affectionately refer to as a pick whip. A pick whip is actually inherited from Go Live, I believe, was the first application that used this, and it allows you to point and shoot to whatever it is that you want to connect to. If we point up here to nothing and let go, you'll see it kind of retracts with a cute little animation there. But we don't want to do that. We actually want to parent our two selected layers to the car. So I'm going to pick whip to the name car.psd. You'll see an outline appears around the layer that we want to parent to, and let go. And once again, both of our layers are now set to parent themselves to our car. So now, if I go back up to our comp window and select our car body, now when I do things like scale it, all of the pieces scale with it, which is very cool. Or if I move it, all the pieces move with it. So I could fairly simply set up an animation. Let me jump home and move kind of off screen left, just sticking on here. I'll hit Option P on the Mac, Alt P on Windows to set a keyframe. I'll shift page down, say 6 or 7 times, just to cross the screen in about 3 seconds. You'll see I've got a little motion path there. And if I jump back to the beginning, you'll see, yeah, we've got a nice animation of me driving by waving. All of which is fine, and all of which is still a little bit impractical. There are aspects of the way this is set up that are fine for what we're doing here, but don't always work in all situations. For example, what if we need it all to fade in at the same time? We've got geometrics inherited, but parenting doesn't pass transparency information on to its children. If I was to solo the transparency option for our car, that's with the letter T for opacity, and now crank down the opacity value, watch what happens to the scene. As the car body fades out, it just leaves the other elements on screen, which is not what we want at all. Okay? Well, you may say, that's no big deal. I can just quickly set transparency values for all these layers, and then they'll simultaneously all fade out at once, right? Well, that'll give us problems as well. If I jump back to our first frame here, whoops, I've still got this positional animation going on, and that's actually going to be a little bit of a problem for this demo. So let me roll out to the center, type the letter P to bring back our positional properties, and I'm just going to turn off the stopwatch for position, which will leave the car exactly where it is on screen and get rid of animation for position. Again, that's a handy use of that little shortcut. Let's go back to transparency again, go back to our first frame, and select all the layers, and hold down Option on the Mac, Alt on Windows, type the letter T, and we've now set a keyframe for opacity for all of our layers. And now I'll move about 2 seconds out, and I'll fade everything down to 0. And I can do that by right-clicking on any one of these values. If I click and drag any one of these values, it's only going to affect the one layer that I drag, and it'll deselect everything else. That's not what I want to do. If I right-click instead and choose Edit Value and set that down to 0 and hit Enter, it will adjust the transparency of every selected layer. Boom. We've just done that, and now we've faded everything out. Looks great on screen, right? I can see the selection, but no objects. But look really closely at the composition as the element fades out, and you'll see that this is not a good fade. As I step through the fade, you'll see everything's kind of starting to go white, which is good, but look, we get about halfway through, and you see one of the big problems of fading out multiple objects that are layered in an After Effects project, because each and every object is going transparent, but because the objects are actually layered on top of each other, during the course of the fade, instead of this all fading out as one object, we're actually seeing the places where the objects overlap. And the illusion of my actually having legs is being blown here, for example. And you can actually see the body of the car through the wheel, etc., as we move along. And this is just not a convincing fade. You'll run into this all the time, and it's really, really frustrating when you don't know what's going on. But what's just going on here is that the combined values of the alpha channels of these two layers are actually creating a situation where the level of transparency where the layers overlap is not quite as transparent as where the layers are visible by themselves. So this little bit of overlap in alpha channel here and around where the wheels are and where I have two copies of my hand are giving us more opacity in our elements, and it's making the elements look unnatural. And basically, it's breaking this crossfade. Another problem with this approach, where you've got large clusters of objects on screen that are trying to behave like a single object, another big problem with this comes when you start applying effects. Let me delete our opacity keyframes by just hitting the delete key. My second keyframe was still highlighted, so we've brought back our steady opacity. I'm going to hit the tilde key to collapse these properties away, and then I'm going to hit F2 to deselect everything, and we're going to now just select our car and apply a drop shadow. Now, a drop shadow is an effect. We haven't talked much about effects yet, but effects are going to make up a large percentage of the programs to come in this series, so we've got to get to them sooner or later. I've been not really avoiding them, but effects are really kind of a slippery slope. Once we get into the realm of effects, we're going to be spending an awful lot of time there. So I've been trying to concentrate on the interface before we dug really too deeply into that. But one of the more common effects you'd probably use would be a drop shadow, a very familiar effect from Photoshop or even Illustrator these days. And you'll find that in the Effect Perspective Drop Shadow. The effect shows up here in the Effect Controls palette. And anything that you see in here can be actively adjusted, just like the things that you see down here in the timeline. This is a really great way to work. All of the effects in After Effects always stay live. They're always parametric. Nothing is permanent. You can always freely turn on and off effects, reorder them, etc. Again, we'll go into great detail about this a little bit later. But for now, I'm just going to drag the distance of our drop shadow a good bit a ways from the background and crank up the softness so we create a nice soft edge drop shadow. And maybe crank up the opacity a little bit as well so we can see it clearly. Let me jump back home again. We'll start at frame 0. And now I'm going to select and copy this drop shadow. And let's say we want to have the drop shadow applied across our entire object. We want the entire object to be casting a shadow on the white background. So I'll select all of the layers except the car layer, which already has a shadow applied to it. And I'll select Paste. Command V on the Mac, Control V on Windows. And now I've pasted the drop shadow to every single layer here in our composition. Now let's take a close look at our composition and see why this is really not a great idea. First of all, because I've got 2 copies of my arm, I've got twice as dark a shadow of my 2 combined arms that I need to have. See? That's no good. Also, my wheels, while they look fine right now, are going to pose a really interesting problem when I hit the space bar. Watch what happens. That's just not what we want to have happen at all, is it? The shadow is actually rotating with the layer. And this again introduces us to one of these concepts that's kind of hard to grasp in After Effects, but the order in which things happen is very, very important in this application. Effects come before geometrics. The effect is applied first, then the rotation is applied, so the end result is that the effect is rotating with the wheel, which is just not acceptable at all. There's a clue to what's going on down in the timeline. If we twirl open the properties for one of our wheel layers, it'll reveal effects. We haven't seen that before. We twirl that open and it'll show us our drop shadow, and inside the drop shadow, it'll show us all of the things that you can do with the drop shadow. We don't need to see those right now. What's important about what we're seeing here, though, is that this represents the render order, or what's referred to as the render pipeline within After Effects. Effects applied to a layer happen first. Then the geometrics of a layer are calculated, anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity. Then there's none on this layer, but after that any mask data is applied and so on from there. There's a fairly complex render order. There's a PDF file on your CD that explains the exact order in which everything takes place in After Effects. I urge you to look at it because learning the order of things is actually an extremely important part about making things look the way that you want them to look in After Effects. Controlling this render pipeline is a very, very important skill to have. So let's basically break this composition apart. Let's get rid of most of it. I'm going to select all of our wheels and delete them. For the time being, I'll keep the 2 Brian layers in place and the car in place. Let's talk about a much better way to add wheels to this vehicle and control the vehicle as if it's a single object. I am, however, going to break the parent-child relationship of these layers and set everything back to none, so there's no parenting involved. We're going to use another way of attaching all of these layers together. And I also, for the time being, want to get rid of the effects on this layer. Now, I don't want to take the time to open each one up and delete them, so I'm just going to turn off the effects layers for these 3 layers so that the drop shadow is no longer applied. Now we've got more or less a neutral ground. Now, instead of bringing in our separate wheel layers that make up our wheel, let's take advantage of the fact that we imported this as a Photoshop comp, 2 separate layers in a Photoshop comp, by opening up the wheel.psd composition that was created when we did that. We double-click. Now let's take a look. We've got a composition that's the size of our wheel, and this composition holds the 2 layers that we want to work with. That's great. If I head down here to our timeline and select our backmost wheel, we're going to be working with its rotation again. I'll type the letter R for rotation, set a keyframe, jump to the end, and once again select and enter 12 rotations for our wheel. And there we've got the rotation just as we did before. Set things to best quality just so as they look good. And now I can close this composition down. Don't need it anymore. And instead of bringing the wheel layers into our main composition, I'm going to bring the wheel composition. And it's going to come in complete with the keyframes that we just set. So I've dragged our wheel into place. A quick glance at my timeline shows me I didn't successfully drag it in at frame 1 because I wasn't set at frame 1. So I'm going to hit Option Home, Alt Home on Windows to take that layer back to the first frame. Now if I hit the space bar, looky there. I don't have any animation going on as far as this composition is concerned for this comp. If I twirl open the wheel layer, There's no keyframes under here. That's because the keyframes are being handled in the previous composition. This is a great example of nesting compositions and letting keyframe work happen in a previous comp. So the comp that has the keyframes is the wheel comp here in the window that we had open a second ago, and that data is being passed through to this composition where we now see the results as rotation on the wheel. The cool thing about this is I can now duplicate the wheel layer. So now I just have two copies of our wheel and drag this up to the front. They both take care of themselves as far as animating is concerned. But here's the cool part. I can now go back into our original wheel composition. I can either double click it here, or a shortcut to get there is to hold the Option key down, Alt key on Windows, and double click on a composition in the timeline. And that'll open up that composition so you can get to it. Now once again, if I jump to my last keyframe, double click on it, and let's change our revolutions to something more extreme like 24, so it'll rotate twice as fast. Click OK, and because I controlled that animation within this composition, when I go back into our main composition, both copies of that comp are going to be updated with the new timing. Now my wheels are whirling along at twice the speed. In fact, it's one of those weird speeds that gives us this optical illusion that the wheels are actually moving backwards. Even though we can clearly see that the text is moving forward, the result of the spokes is that it goes backwards. You ever seen that happen when you're on the road and you're underneath like a street light at night? That's pretty cool. So that's one of the great advantages of nested compositions. But nested compositions aren't limited to being just one deep. You can take this as far as you need to take it in After Effects, because we still have a situation here where our wheels are not properly attached to our car. Let me go back into our wheel.psd composition and change our second keyframe back to 12, so we have a more reasonable rotation speed. And we could, like before, parent our wheels to the car body. That'd be fine. But we'd still be stuck with the same situation that we had before, where the wheels would be parented to the body. If we wanted to fade the thing out, it would be a problem, etc. Well, what we have here is a composition. This composition is an object existing on a transparent background. So we're free to move this entire composition into another composition. When we do that, let's do it by just clicking and dragging it on the New Composition button. We leave ourselves with a single layer to control. That layer contains all of the animation that we need. But now we only have one set of keyframes to manage. We only have one layer to scale. We only have one layer to move. Much easier to keep track of. And more important, if we wanted to fade out this layer, it would all fade out as a single piece with none of the weird artifacts that we saw. Very, very cool. And if we wanted to apply a drop shadow to it, and I should still have that in my copy buffer, so I'm just going to hit Command-V to paste, and sure enough, I pasted my drop shadow. And the drop shadow properly sticks to our object, because the drop shadow is now being applied after all of the geometrics that we're seeing here, so everything keeps up. So working with nested compositions has its advantages. Working with parenting also has its advantages. But working with nested compositions has real advantages. It's such a great way to work, in fact, that After Effects gives us an even more powerful tool with which to create them. Let me close down our comp here and go back to our previous composition where we have all of our car pieces. And let's make one more assumption about this composition. Let's add a new solid to it. Basically, a new solid is just a new solid color. You can find it up here in the Layer menu under New Solid, or the keyboard shortcut for that is Command-Y. We'll be seeing this box an awful lot during the course of the After Effects training because we do a lot of effects work starting out with solids. One of the most important buttons in the interface that comes up here is the Make Comp Size button, which basically snaps the solid to the size of the current composition, which is great. The other important thing in here is the color. Let's just give ourselves a nice recognizable color, maybe sort of a pale green. Click OK. And now the solid is added to the scene and it's in front of everything else. I need to move that to the back. So that's Command-Shift left bracket. Now the solid is now behind our car. The reason I just added that solid is to show you that very often in the case of projects, you'll find yourself with a few objects that you need to link together, but they're already living in a composition with other objects that you don't want to be linked to that layer. Right now, if I dragged this composition into another composition, the background solid will come with it, and I won't have any transparency to work with, and that won't be great. So how do I create a composition out of the foreground elements without including the background element? And how do I do that while staying inside of our current composition? Well, you do it with a technique called pre-composing. Back in the oldest days of After Effects, it was called compify. But pre-composing allows you to kind of work backwards in time. Now that we've set up all of this work, we now decide that we actually want to work with this as a single object. In fact, let's make the object even more complicated than it already is. I'll duplicate both of our wheels here, and I'm going to actually drag the wheels in, the copies in a little bit, and then send them back progressively until they're back behind the car body. And now it looks like we have even more perspective than we had before. So this is becoming quite a complicated object here. How do I connect all of these layers together into a composition without leaving the comp? The answer is pre-compose. So let me select all of the necessary layers that we have to work with here. Is that everything? I think it is. I don't want the background solid. I just want everything else involved. And now we're going to go up to the Layer menu, and down at the bottom, the very last choice at the bottom is Pre-Compose. As is one of the most important keyboard shortcuts you can memorize, Command-Shift-C for Pre-Compose. Learn that keyboard shortcut. I didn't select it because now I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut, Command-Shift-C, and the Pre-Compose window pops up. We'll give the composition a name that makes sense. This is incredibly important. We'll call it Whole Car. We're only given the option of moving all attributes into the new composition. There are times when you're working with a single layer that you have to choose between these first two options. The first option we'll explain later on when we're dealing with effects. But right now, this is the only option that you're given. You also can click the box to open the new composition if you like. Why don't we go ahead and do that? Because it might explain a little bit about what's going on here. Click OK, and After Effects, out of those selected layers, will magically create a new composition. You can see now I have 3 tabs up here in my comp window and 3 tabs down here at the bottom. All of the layers I had selected are in this composition. They're all connected together. A little tap of the space bar confirms that everything's working the way it's supposed to. That's great. And look, over here in the project window, a new composition has shown up called Whole Car. That's the composition that we just made. And the most important thing is, if we go back into our main composition, the one we've been working in all along, you'll see that Whole Car comp has now been magically and automatically not only created up here in the project window, but added to the composition where we originally performed the pre-compose. There's absolutely no difference about this than there is about building a composition and just dragging it in. Pre-composing is a way of generating a nested composition, just like any other nested composition. It just does it automatically on the fly and allows you to kind of move backwards in time. It's as if we built the car first and then brought it into this comp. But by using pre-composing, we were able to keep everything in our main composition and only group stuff together as needed. And now, of course, that it's grouped together, we can once again paste, which will paste a drop shadow to our layer up here. Jump back to our first frame and drag it off screen. Hit Option P on the Mac, Alt P on Windows to add a positional keyframe, jump 4 or 5 seconds out, drag the results off the right-hand side of the screen, and you see, as simple as that, 2 keyframes, and we've generated a cute little animation. Now, don't worry if you don't completely grasp the repercussions of pre-composing versus just generating a comp and dragging it into something else versus parenting, etc. These are subtle differences between complex actions, and really the best way to illustrate the reasons you would use one versus using the other are coming. Those reasons primarily have to do with creating complex scenes and complex effects, and as we go along and use these techniques, we'll point out to you and illustrate why we choose one approach over the other. Because very often there's a clear reason to do it, but the reason isn't terribly clear until we show you exactly what we're talking about. Right now, I wanted to introduce the concepts. Hopefully this lesson did a pretty decent job of showing you the pros and cons of working with nested compositions versus working with parenting. Before we leave the concept of compositions, though, there's another important feature of comps that we need to talk about. So far, we've keyframed the geometric properties of layers. We've keyframed their transparency. We've even played with a few effects. But one thing we haven't talked about is After Effects' ability to allow you to keyframe time. It's called time remapping. And if you look in your project window, we have a composition all set up to illustrate what's going on with this topic. Just to keep things from getting too cluttered, let me turn off our filters. Let me turn off our compositions that we're not going to be using. Say goodbye to little waving Brian there. And now let's just concentrate on our time remapping comp. I'll even go back to our workspace and choose D1 half res to get our windows back where we like them. I don't really want the checkerboard background, so Option click on that little tab will bring back our black background. Now the visible file that we have here is called Type on Movie. It's actually kind of a thin, wide movie, so I'm going to drag it down a little bit so we can see it from this view down here. It doesn't matter if it's occupying the bottom part of the screen. I've got a couple other movies that we're going to use to illustrate this topic a little more extensively as we go on, but I'm going to start with the Type on Movie because it presents us with a fairly common situation. And that situation is we have a movie that's much shorter than the composition which it occupies, and we need to essentially find out a way to hold the last keyframe. The movie itself is pretty simple as we page down through it a frame at a time. It just reveals our slogan one letter at a time. That's SMARTS, one of the slogans for T3V. That's SMARTS. But obviously, if we just go back to frame 0 and hit the space bar, well, it just plays and goes away. We want to hold that last frame on screen. Well, this is a great job for time remapping. A lot of people who are inexperienced might go to the trouble of exporting this last frame as an image, as a still, and then bringing that still in and dropping it in after the movie to create essentially a fakey freeze frame. But you don't need to do that. All you have to do is choose Layer, again down near the bottom, Enable Time Remapping, or Command Option T for Time Remapping. We select that, and it doesn't look like much has happened on screen. But if you look closely at our timeline, whereas before we just had emptiness to the right of this layer, we now have what you should now recognize as potential blank area to work with. And you get the icon for slip and slide when we hover over it. But most importantly, if we tap our U key, you'll see we've got a couple of new keyframes in here. And if you look to the left of those keyframes, you'll see we have a new animatable property called Time Remap. Time Remap essentially lets us control the timing of layers with keyframes. But in the case of just wanting to hold the last frame of an animation, it's also very useful. Now that we have enabled time remapping for this layer, we're free to grab this triangle and just drag it out as far as we want it to go. And now, as we check our animation, you'll see that now, as we drag the words type on screen as before, and then hold, which is great. But of course, time remapping does a lot more than this. These are keyframes after all, which means we can move them around, we can copy them, we can paste them, etc. In fact, the first thing I want to do is click and drag them out a ways to show that we can also have time remapping hold the first frame. See, we've got no keyframe before this first frame, so it's basically going to stop and present us only with that first frame moving forward in time. So until we get to the frame, we get no motion, and then the words type on, and then they stay on. Also, we can separate these keyframes from each other to drastically slow down time. So that will type the letters on much more slowly than it did before, which can be desirable. Give us something that looks a little more interesting than everything just zipping on screen as if it's being wiped on. Now, once again, these are keyframes, so if I select them and say copy them, Command-C on the Mac, and then paste copies and paste copies again, we should be able to predict by now that we move forward in time from the first keyframe to the second, and then we would move backwards in time from the second back to the first, and then forwards in time, and then backwards in time, and so on. Now, hopefully this is beginning to maybe make some light bulbs go off above your head about possible cool things you can actually do with time remapping. But before we get on to actually time remapping real movies and not just animated graphics, let me talk about a couple of other things that are important to know. First of all, time remapping to irregular values can result in stuttery playback, meaning in the case of this particular graphic, we're in pretty decent shape. We're not going to really notice if one letter hangs on more frames than the other one does. But if we've time remapped a piece of video and we've time remapped it to irregular values, we can actually get kind of stuttery playback. And one of the ways that After Effects allows us to kind of smooth out that stutteriness is with a feature called frame blending. Frame blending is something that you should definitely consider using when you're working with time remapping. Let me jump back to our first frame of our animation here and delete these keyframes back here. Frame blending is a switch, like some of the other quality switches that you see here. It's the switch that's underneath what looks like the film strip. This little thing that might also look like a drum is also a film strip. If you turn frame blending on and enable the frame blending master switch so it actually shows up in our comp, as we step through our animation now, take a close look at exactly what's going on up here in the comp window. As I move forward a frame, you'll see a hint of the letter H fading in, and then it's faded in a little bit more, and a little bit more, and now it's with us, and the next letter starts fading in. I have time stretched these frames so that they're more spread out than they were before. And what frame blending does is it actually generates cross-faded frames from between real frames. And the cross-faded frames are there to try to smooth out the motion so that it looks better when you play it back after you've time remapped it. If I set this to best quality, frame blending actually looks much, much better at best quality. And I preview this animation, or a little bit of it anyway, you'll see it's a much smoother result than before. It's not necessarily better for when you're typing on text, because this doesn't really look like typing now. But for time remapping video footage, frame blending can be a godsend. Let's take a look at that. Let me turn off our text layer. I'm going to close this back down again. Oops, the layer that I actually want to illustrate next is not here in the composition. Let me quickly twirl open my time remapping source. That's the one I'm looking for, an Art Beats traffic clip. I'm going to drag that now down into our composition here below our Type On movie. And I'm going to hit Command-Option-F to fit that clip to the screen. Come down and turn on frame blending for this layer. Make sure it's set to best quality. It is. Turn off frame blending for the previous layer. We don't really need to worry about that layer anymore, but just to be neat. And now let's adjust the time stretch for this layer. I'm not so worried about time remapping per se. Let's just globally time stretch and see what the results are of setting different values when it comes to frame blending. Let me open up to our time stretch, and I'm going to set this to, say, 20%. So it's now playing 5 times faster than it used to. And now with frame blending on, look at the cars in there. Frame blending is helping us generate a really nice interframe motion blur from the motion that we had before. Frame blending on a faster clip generates from a movie an artificial sort of motion blur. I can turn off the frame blending again, and you can see these are what the full frames look like. The frame blended clips look like this. Nice, realistic motion blur. So that's extremely useful. What happens if we go the other way? What if instead of going 5 times the speed, we go 1/5 the speed? Let's go to 500%. So we're stretching our clip to 500% its original size, which means it's going to go 1/5 the speed. Click OK. And now, with frame blending turned on, let's see what that looks like. As I advance a frame at a time through the comp, you'll see the image will appear to sort of pop in and out of focus as it generates these cross-faded clips between each other. In certain situations, this can kind of produce an artifact that's undesirable. But in this particular case, if we just generate a RAM preview of a little bit of what we're talking about, you can see that that little extra bit of fade actually just keeps things smooth. They may not be realistic. This may not look like we actually shot it with a high-speed camera, but at least it gives it a kind of a smooth, dreamy effect that's, in most cases, preferable to the alternative without frame blending, which basically looks like this, and is not nearly so appealing. So frame blending is an essential part of time remapping. Whether you're speeding things up or slowing them down, frame blending will usually improve the image. There's only so far you can go with this. You can't go from normal speed footage to extremely slow-mo footage and actually get something that looks like a Michael Jordan commercial rushing to the basket. You just can't do that. The only way to create those kinds of clips where you have extreme changes in motion is to shoot them high speed to begin with and then use time remapping to go the other way. Use the time remapping to generate the normal speed clip from the extreme slow motion clip. A good example of that is the next clip down here in the comp window, the one marked golfer.mov. Turn off our art beats traffic and turn on our golfer. Jump back home. And let me close down our time stretch values because we don't really need them anymore. Now let's enable time remapping for our golfer movie. That's Command-Option-T, Control-Alt-T on Windows. And that brings up our time remapping keyframes. If yours didn't come up, just type the letter U and they'll show up for you. As before, we've set a keyframe at the beginning and at the end of our movie. That's the default behavior of time remapping. What we have here is a very slow motion movie of a golfer doing his thing. And what we want to do is we want to speed up the beginning portion, let's say until we get about halfway through his downswing, and then we want to go into the slow motion that we have right now. So let me set a keyframe at that point. And then we'll have the slow motion continue through the swing to about this point, another keyframe, and then we'll speed up again. So we know that to speed things up in After Effects, one of the ways to do it is to move keyframes together. So now that we've got these two keyframes bracketing the area that we want to keep slow, it's very, very important that you do things in this order, that you create the bracketed areas that you want to keep slow when you've got high-speed footage. Let's select all of these keyframes now and move them as a block. By dragging these over to the left, we're going to now speed up the time between the first and second keyframe. The second and third keyframes will play at the normal slow motion speed. And now if we drag over our third keyframe, we're basically just picking arbitrary values here, but if I twirl open my velocity curves, I can actually get a visual representation of speed by comparing the before and after line that you see down here as I adjust this keyframe. If this line is higher than the one before it, then this second area will be going too fast. If it's lower than the plateau before it, then this second bit's going to be going too slow. If I want them to be going the same speed, I just need to more or less match up their values here. And you'll see, of course, in between the other two, it's much, much slower, which is exactly what we wanted. Let's set ourselves an end point for our animation by typing the N key at this point. That sets our work area there. And let's RAM preview this and see what we've got. Well, after the RAM preview has calculated, we have still a little bit of a slow backswing, but then it slows down a little bit more and speeds back up again. Not as extreme as I would like, so let's adjust our keyframes even more. Drag them over here, and then get this last one and drag it over until our two plateaus meet again. We'll RAM preview that. And you'll see we get a much more natural backswing and then a slower portion in the center. Now, as I said before, this could be improved by enabling frame blending for this layer. We'll turn on the frame blending switch, and that should give us a bit more of a motion blur type effect, particularly on his backswing. And you'll see we get a much more blurred effect, and then a more stuttery effect in the center there. Very, very good. So that's how they do those fast, slow, fast commercials that you see featuring like Michael Jordan, as I said before, or race cars going fast and slow. They shoot the stuff ultra slow motion to begin with, and then they remap it in post. Or in some cases, they have incredibly expensive cameras that can change speed on the fly, but that's really kind of taking a lot of risk in your own hands. If you just shoot the stuff really, really slow motion to begin with, you're much better off. Now, we talked a little bit about velocity curves. And if you remember messing with velocity curves a little while back, you know that you can ease in and ease out of things. And yes, you can do that with time remapping keyframes as well. You can create smooth transitions. But I will tell you that you'll very rarely get really satisfactory results doing this with pre-rendered movie footage, unless it's at incredibly high speeds so that you have a lot of intermediate frames. you're going to result in stuff that looks a little odd as the frames speed up and slow down. Frame blending does an admirable job of keeping up with it, but where velocity curves really come into play with time remapping is not with movie footage at all, but with geometric data in After Effects. If we turn off our golfer movie, the last layer in this composition is a pre-composition. It's a clock that's basically a series of Illustrator layers that have been animated in a pre-comp so that over the course of 2 seconds, the hands spin around, the minute hand spins around 12 times, the hour hand spins all the way around 1 time, and the results are we have an animation that looks an awful lot like a real clock whirling around in one of those movies where they want to show you time passing really quickly. If we preview just a little bit of that, you'll see what I mean. Now, that's a very extreme animation, and it's almost hard to even see exactly what's going on. So let's take this layer and, once again, enable time remapping, Command-Option-T, hit the U key so that our time remapping keyframes are visible, and we'll drag our layer out to the end of the composition. And this time we're going to open up our velocity curves for time remapping. First of all, I'm going to drag our second keyframe way out to the end of our work area so that now things are going to be playing much more slowly. That's good. So once again, time remapping is a precise way to speed stuff up and slow it down. But in addition to that, we can play with the velocity curves. We can just select the 2 keyframes if we want and hit F9 to create an easy ease. And if we generate a RAM preview of this, you'll see don't have to worry about any of this weird, blurry, intermediate frame stuff that you get from QuickTime movies. Nope. After Effects is able to time remap the original geometrics in this file. And what that means is that it has all the information it needs to generate all of the internal keyframes, so you get incredibly smooth animation. So time remapping is a very, very powerful way to control the precise animations of compositions that you've created. I'm not going to go much deeper than that here at this point because we're going to be using time remapping again and again throughout this series, so we'll have ample time to reinforce these concepts. So that's frame blending, time remapping, and just about every other important thing I could think of to tell you about compositions. Any other little things I may have left out, rest assured we're going to be spending many, many more hours in this application, and a lot more fun stuff's going to be coming up in the hours to come.